The G20 meet here in Bali. We also caught up exclusively with the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire. He told CNBC-TV18 that any dilution of the G20 Bali text on Ukraine will not be acceptable to the G7. He also spoke about the need to implement the common framework on debt resolution to help countries like Zambia and Sri Lanka, and the need to reform and strengthen multilateral development banks. Listen in. Let me begin by asking you about your focus during this G20 presidency and the priorities that India should have during this 1 year.
First of all, I would like to insist on the perfect organization of this G20. India has done really a great job to organize a very constructive G20 meeting. I think that first of all we have to face the consequences of the war in Ukraine. We were talking about the final communiqué. We want the final communiqué to stick to the wording of the G20 in Bali, not to step back on the condemnation of the illegal aggression of Ukraine. Second, I think that one of the key challenge is the risk of having a fragmentation of the globalization due to the difficulties of the developing countries. So we should all gather, thanks to the leadership of India, to provide more effective financial and technical support to developing countries that have been facing the consequences of COVID, of inflation, of the war in Ukraine, and of course of climate change.
Right. How would you like the Ukraine-Russia war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine to be condemned in the communiqué? And which are these countries which want the Bali text to be watered down?
Well, we cannot water down a communiqué that has been decided by the head of states. And we cannot water down a communiqué which makes very clear that we all condemn the illegal and brutal aggression of Ukraine. I would like to quote Prime Minister Modi when he says it is not an era of war. He is fully right, and we should stick to the wise sentence of Prime Minister Modi. This is not an era of war, and it would be a mistake not to have a ceasefire, not to put that war to an end.
Right. I would also like to ask you about some of the main economic priorities that you would like the G20 to address, especially around the common framework on debt resolution and changes in the international financial architecture. Let's first talk about the common framework because debt in many emerging economies is a major cause for concern, especially when we're looking at the global financial situation.
You're right. I really think that debt is maybe one of the most significant concerns for many developing countries. So we have to address the issue, and we have the right tool, because when you are looking at the common framework, it proved to be very efficient in the restructuring of the debt of Chad. So we should get use of the same instrument to deal with the difficulties in Ghana, in Sri Lanka, for example. And I've been discussing the point with the Indian finance minister, with the Indian presidency, which fully shares this assessment that this is time to implement the common framework. It is not time to change the common framework.
Right. What is the responsibility of countries like China when it comes to debt and transparency on the amount of debt that is there?
China is a key country and one of the major superpowers in the world, which means that China has a key responsibility too. And we really count on China to play the game of the common framework. China has been very helpful in dealing with the situation in Chad. And we would like really to have China on board, having exactly the same attitude for the countries that are also facing this burden of very high debt and which are asking for a very quick and fair restructuring of their debt.
Right. On the international financial architecture, what are the changes that you're seeking this time in the G20 meeting?
I think that one of the key points is the role of the multilateral development banks, which have a key role to play in the fight against climate change and in the financial solution that we need to provide to developing countries to face the consequences of climate change and to prevent climate change. So this is one of the points that should be addressed under the G20 presidency of India.
On the bilateral front, you had a meeting, a constructive meeting with Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Could you give us a sense of how the French-India economic ties are set to evolve. Your meetings that have taken place, apart from the ministerial and duties here at the G20?
I'm just smiling because I would say that we have a perfect bilateral relationship with India. And we have been having this relationship for many years, for many decades. India is a key country. India has a key role to play between the eastern countries and the western countries. I think that on the bilateral front, we have many deliverables which are quite positive. I'm thinking, of course, of the Airbus aircraft that has been bought by Air India. We have many other prospects. We are talking together on the key question of nuclear energy. And you know, when you are talking about nuclear energy with a country, since this is a very sensitive technology, it is a very clear evidence that you have a very profound and a friendly relationship. I think that it's time now to expand this economic relationship to new fields. Renewable energies, hydrogen, green cities, transportation. On all those topics, I think that there is room for improving and accelerating the relationship between our two countries.
My final question, Minister, what are the risks that you see to the global economy this year, which France is preparing for, the risks to the French economy and the European economy?
The war in Ukraine. Let's be very clear, there cannot be sustainable and stable economic development with the risk of an extension of the war in Ukraine. So that's why we want to condemn on the strongest manner the illegal aggression of Russia. And everybody should be aware that the conflict in Ukraine is not a regional conflict. It is affecting the global economy. It is a global conflict.